let's move on to some of the largest problems you have worked on, and how did you overcome them?
Well, let me start with transportation. In the late 70s, for a variety of factors, Orange County was not getting its fair share of state or federal transportation money. And there just was not enough money to build the level of infrastructure that was needed. At that time, up in Silicon Valley, there was change in law and it allowed Santa Clara County to impose its own sales tax and use it for transportation. The Irvine Company really took the lead in gathering people in the county, other primarily other big businesses. Um, People were suspect that a developer would be asking that they raise their taxes for the good of everybody. So a coalition was put together. I worked on that for probably 8 years. And ultimately, the citizens of Orange County, at that time a pretty conservative place, um, put it on the ballot. Let's raise the sales tax by at first a penny for transportation. That got beat very badly. We regrouped. We came back a second time, and finally a third time after a change in state law, we got 55% to make that happen. But that was about an 8 year effort to make that happen, and it took an awful lot of time. But the Irvine Company was really the leader, um, both behind the scenes and publicly, in making that happen.
Absolutely. And again, that's that long-term focus and perspective. There aren't many folks that can say, Mike, you go out there and work for the better part of a decade on getting this transportation initiative enacted. One other, we did surveys at the company, Mike, I think it was at least twice a year, we would survey people in the
Yes.
community. And one of the things that I've always been fascinated by this that came back was that there were two things that would make a difference in the community's acceptance of continued growth. And they were adequate roadways and adequate schools, adequate good schools. So the company put a big focus on that. And I mentioned a few minutes ago that, Proposition 13 enacted in 1978 really upset how infrastructure like schools was financed. So one of the things we did, and I spent quite a bit of time working on this with our advocate in Sacramento and other interests around the state, we developed a legislation called the Community Facilities Financing District legislation, often referred to as the Mello-Roos Act, named after two legislators who were instrumental in that was enacted in the early 80s. The Irvine Company, with its control of a vast amount of land, worked with the Irvine Unified School District, and we created a 38,000-acre school facilities, community facilities financing district, and authorized it for over $1 billion of school facilities, which I think up until just 5 years ago, new schools were being constructed out of that financing. And the company clearly was a key organizer behind the scenes to a large degree, but a key organizer in getting that to happen. Another example is in the environmental area.
I'm sorry, how did that get funded? I may have missed it. How did
that was, okay, good point. Good question. It's funded through an authorization to exceed the Proposition 13 limit on property tax. So Proposition 13 limits your property tax to 1% of value.
Mm-hmm.
So this, and the big prohibition in that initiative was that you couldn't increase the ad valorem tax, the tax related to value, but it didn't prohibit taxes based on vehicle trips generated or students that are in a house, so that the community facilities tax is based on estimated student generation from residential households, and that allows the tax to exceed the 1%. So the people who move into the houses pay back the bonds that are issued. So this allows future residents to participate over the long term at lower interest rates as compared to what private market interest rates were in those days to fund those facilities.
Yeah, and the key was when you set it up, if you had fewer than 12 residents living
Yes.
in the area, then the property owner was the one who essentially created the district and authorized it. So the district was drawn on empty land owned by the Irvine Company, and the Irvine Company voted the bonds in. And as time passed, as people moved into a house, they picked up that obligation. In the house that I live in, our 30-year obligation ended about 5 years ago. But in the newest development in Irvine, the Great Park, that's exactly how they're financing major infrastructure out there. They're creating those elements before anybody moves in. The landowner votes it in, and the bonds are issued. So uh, Pike is too modest. I mean, he and a couple of other people up there working with Mike Roos and Henry Mello essentially created this financing, and it's changed the way that you were able to deal with things post Proposition 13.
That's fascinating because you really are creating something that doesn't exist. So how
Right.
do you even go about that?
That's
And
right.
you're dealing with the government and you're dealing with people that
Right.
are going
And
to be
so when
living
you're
there.
right, when you're working on that in that company, you can imagine that that would be difficult to communicate that concept to a lot of people. At
Yeah.
the Irvine Company, it was no problem. Everybody got it, including Donald Brin. No problem at all. And that carried through to a lot of other things. There was one other example of creative problem solving that I was going to mention. One of the first things I got involved with there was a creek, San Diego Creek, doesn't run much in the summertime, but in the winter it can have big flows, and it drains into an environmental resource called Upper Newport Bay, which is a whole story in and of itself. At the time, there was concern about the quality of what was going into the bay, and we had to work out a management plan. It took the Irvine Company coordinating with 22 different governmental agencies at the local, state, regional, and federal level to work out that program. And the Irvine Company was, along with others, but the Irvine Company was the one that really had the major motivation to get it done and kept everybody coming back to the table to work it out.
The other big environmental issue with a focus, and it was the 4 miles of open land on the coast between Laguna Beach and Newport Beach. The Irvine coast that had been empty for decades, and it took 3 efforts in 2 different ownerships dealing with the Coastal Commission to bring that to fruition. And all you have to do is to see the changes, look at the initial plan from, I think, 1975 or 76. It contemplated up to 50,000 people on the coast. I think today the population is around maybe 8,000 or in
Oh,
that
wow.
that order of magnitude. But in 1972, again, it goes back to what the state was like and what the public attitudes were like. There was no coastal commission until 1972. And had there not been a coastal commission, there probably would have been 40,000 people on the Irvine coast. That's not the case. So again, this was something that people that were at the Irvine Company, some people worked for 6, 8, 10 years just on the plan for entitling the coast. And then came the question of how do you market it? How do you sell it? And at the very end, again, water quality, as Pike indicated, came back. The final element of the coast, there were big problems with water quality that had to be dealt with. So that's it's just not something that most developers could have ever sustained over time.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a personal comment, I still mourn the fact that the original plan for the Irvine coast wasn't implemented. It was a scheme that involved creating a series of villages. It would be like the hill towns in the south of France or on the Italian Riviera with the funiculars going up from the coast up to these hill towns. It would have been really stunning, but that was not to be. On the other hand, out of the 10,000 acres on the coast, there's now something on the order of about 7,000 acres of open space, which is accessible to the public, and a great. Every time I go to Orange County, I try to make time for a hike on the hills above the Irvine coast.
And Stephanie, in our next book, we're going to track probably the 12 or 15 largest home sales on the Newport coast, which routinely go in the 20s, some into the 30s. And we're going to find that about 15 houses, the cost of 15 houses is going to exceed what Al Taubman and his partners paid for the Irvine Ranch in 1977.
Yeah.
And the joke at the company used to be, but it's not going to be a joke, was when it's all over, the last acre of land that's sold is going to be worth more than what Taubman and company paid in 1977. And, you know, it may not be the last acre, but perhaps the last 100 acres
Yep.
of prime real estate for housing. It's going to come close.
I bet. I bet. And so how did you guys tackle the water quality issue? That's a major issue that came in at the end of things?
Well, yes, as Mike's describing for the Irvine coast, it was an issue that came up with a little area called Crystal Cove, right at the
Yeah.
end of the whole effort. And the one I was describing was a larger area, and that was earlier on. But we solved those problems. I mean, I wasn't around and Mike wasn't around to solve that last one. But the approach the company took is the same approach it always took, which is find the experts, get them involved, tell them to work out a solution that will be acceptable to the people whose primary mission in life is water quality, and figure out how it can be done and still allow the company to achieve its goals. And that's the approach that was taken on every issue, big or small.
Oh,
Yeah, and it's worth noting, it would take another whole podcast to mention everybody, but in the 30, 40 years that this has been done, the attorneys, the specialized attorneys, the consultants, the engineers, when El Toro was an issue, people that understood jet noise, there was just an army of people that worked for the Irvine Company on a consulting basis that helped to make this happen. And the bill has to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars over time that was spent
yeah.
for those people to give their expertise. And as Pike said, you know, that was a real big part of dealing with bureaucrats, with regulators. You know, once you're willing to speak their language and try to meet them halfway and have facts to deal with, that makes a big difference. The Irvine Company was rarely confrontational. It rarely raised its voice, if you will, and
Mm.
it had the ability to look long term and to say, we can solve this. It may take some time, but let's put the resources to it.
Yeah. And at the
Amazing.
same time, people knew it wouldn't go away. So
Good point.
the voices might have been kept at a moderate level, but they were always going to be there. So, you know, the choice was, well, what are you going to do? In fact, we were interviewing one of the key people who worked for decades on the large open space and habitat reserve program. And she described for us a situation when there was a big challenge with the Endangered Species Act back in the early 90s. And the company worked on creating a very large-scale multi-species habitat conservation planning program that was implemented on the ranch and many other places. And what she said was interesting to me is that the company knew that if it didn't figure out a solution, it could be a showstopper on a large portion of its property.
Mm.
But at the same time, the environmental interests who were pursuing that knew that if they created a showstopper, not only for the Irvine Company, but other large properties throughout Southern California, there would probably at some point be an erosion of the law that they were trying to work with to get this implemented. So in a sense, it was mutual fear that resulted in the ability to create that solution. And the
Wow.
company's persistence in finding the facts, getting the science-based approach to meeting the requirements put in place.
Wow, I'm sure we could talk for days on end, and this has been so fun and enlightening. Thank you so much for making the time to be here. We'll definitely schedule another podcast
Great.
with you guys if you
Thank
want to
you.
come back.
Sure, be happy to
Um,
come back.
Absolutely.
Just remember,
and
you can buy our book on Amazon, Transforming the Irvine Ranch, Joan Irvine, William Pereira, Ray Watson, and The Big Plan.
yep, that was going to be my next question. How can our listeners get in touch with you?
So if you go to the website, thebigplanbook.com, there's a page where Mike and I have nice pictures and a one paragraph bio. And right below that is our email address. And we're happy to correspond with folks. You can also find the table of contents and other elements related to things that are going on in the Irvine Ranch. So thebigplanbook.com.
And on our Amazon page, you can read the first 4 chapters for free, and it'll give you a real sense of, the kind of how we approach the subject and how we deal with it. And just to finish up, in addition to the corporate side of this, the family history of the Irvine family is just fascinating. We describe it as Shakespearean. Joan Irvine Smith used to say, "My life is like the television show Dynasty," and she wasn't far off.
And do you guys are you only working on the book, or do you do consulting on the side?
I'm
retired.
Okay, so
I'm working on
writers.
retirement, but I'm not getting high grades. I spent some time in education, teaching at the university level in my later years, and I had a bit of a reputation for not said the other day that I was a kind of a therapist to people involved in challenging development projects. So I do a little bit of that. I also advise
Okay,
the League of Women Voters on housing policy as pro bono work.
awesome. Wow, thank you so much to both of you for being here. I really appreciate your time very much.
Thanks for
Thank
the
you,
opportunity.
Stephanie.